Thank you for having me for this final session of this semester's seminar. I will be presenting my job market paper, which deals with the question of the impact of immigration on health, but it does so from not yet explored perspective of the firm. So across most OECD countries, immigration is a major demographic force that's reshaping the composition of the workforce. Over the last decade, we've had 50 million immigrants arrive into the OECD, and 80% of them are working age, which is a significantly higher share than the 65% for the native workers. In the EU, there is also almost a 15-year gap in terms of median age between native and immigrants. And this is just to show that immigration or immigrant workers are becoming an increasingly prominent part of the representative workplace. Despite the extensive research on the impact of immigration on the labor market outcomes of the natives, we actually know surprisingly little about their impact on health. At the same time, it's a crucial outcome to consider because illness-related absences harm worker productivity, firm productivity, and therefore, by extension, the economy or the performance of the economy. In Germany, which is the country I will study, sorry, let me just, yeah. In Germany, which is the country that I study in my paper, 15 workdays were lost per worker on average in 2022. And according to some estimates, half a day extra reduces the GDP of Germany by 0.5%. Severe incidences, which cause absences of at least 6 weeks and are focus of my paper, they cause a disproportionate share of these lost days of about 40%. To convince you further that studying sick leave is important, I show you here a recent article from the Financial Times, which discusses the impact of sickness on productivity and productivity losses in Germany. But importantly, it also shows that these sick leave rates that are quite high in Germany are actually part of a broader trend across many more countries. This makes this outcome quite an important one to study, in particular when it comes to the determinants of sickness and sick leave. When we think about how immigration can impact health, there are many potential channels here at play. You could think about the labor market channel. So in particular, perhaps immigration causes changes in in the kinds of occupations that are performed by incumbent workers, or perhaps immigration causes displacement or wage effects. So here I just point a few papers. It's not possible to kind of enlist all the literature that deals with the impact on native workers' labor market outcomes. But importantly, health can be affected in other ways, such as through the local access to health services. So with more immigrants, we have more patients, and that might affect waiting times or general the availability of healthcare at the local level. And at the same time, immigrants can also become healthcare workers, right? So they can increase the supply of healthcare, as well as affect the demand. We can also think about the broader fiscal impact that immigrant might have on the public health infrastructure through the tax and social security system. And while we have some evidence on these channels from previous literature, it is very difficult to disentangle them with a regional level analysis of health outcomes. And so what I do in my paper and what the key contribution of my paper is to decrease the level of the analysis and look at the impact of the on firms or within firms. This allows me to non-parametrically control for the regional characteristics and trends, and in particular, study the labor market channel in isolation from the remaining channels that occur at the broader levels of exposure to foreign workforce. Specifically in my paper, I ask what is the effect of increasing the relative size of foreign workforce on the incidence of severe health shocks among workers and firms. So here I analyze or I operationalize the incidence of severe health shocks with long-term sick leave, which I can observe in rich administrative data from Germany. This allows me to to start with a model with a very rich set of fixed effects that allows me to control for many conceivable confounders, but also I build a firm level instrumental variable that uses historical characteristics of firms in order to predict their foreign employment after a policy change. And this policy change in particular will be the labor market openings towards the new member states of the European Union that I will discuss in detail later on. I compared the results using my firm level IV with those obtained when I used a market level instrument, so a shift share instrument, more an off-the-shelf approach. In terms of the contribution, as I've already mentioned, this will be the first paper to investigate the impact of immigration on health at the firm level. That allows me to study, quantify, and isolate the different mechanisms that I'm interested in, and also importantly, model firm heterogeneity. So within this crowd, I probably don't need to say much about this, but so recently there has been a number of papers that show that actually even within kind of quite detailed or quite small cells, there is a wide range or wide firm heterogeneity when it comes to foreign hiring. And so with my paper, I will be able to firstly control for unobservable firm characteristics, but also speak to which kind of firms are driving my results or in which kind of firms these results are most observed. Okay, so what do I find in a nutshell? I find that firms with higher proportions of foreigners, so a higher share of foreign workers, have a lower long-term sick leave incidence. So these can be quite large effects, as a 10 percentage points 10 percentage point increase in the foreign share decreases the total sick leave rate by almost 10% of its mean. When I decompose these effects, I find that this decrease is actually specific to native men only. So neither the native women nor foreign workers in general are affected by the hiring of the foreign workers. When it comes to the comparison between the firm level versus market level exposure, I find that the firm level exposure to foreigners is actually the one driving the result. These results are favorable, in particularly, or observed in particular in blue-collar industries, so in construction or trade companies. And out of the number of mechanisms that I study, I find that the predominant one is a decrease in the share of natives that perform manual tasks in firms, which could potentially shield them from either physical injury or physical strain at work. Quite briefly on the literature, so there's, as I mentioned, a number of papers that explore the impact of immigration on native health, and they show improvements in health using the shift share regional level analysis. And here I can model firm heterogeneity, study the mechanisms, and also gauge whether the effects that we already know from the literature can be actually found within firms or are a result of a cross-firm sorting of native, so essentially native and foreign workers going into different kinds of firms. I then marry this migration and native health literature with the firm perspective on migration literature by being the one to give a health outcome to the firm level immigration studies. For the outline of my talk, it's quite standard, so I will walk you through the data that I'm using and some descriptive evidence to give you a sense of, in particular, of what this long-term sick leave rate is capturing. I will then talk about my estimation strategy, then the results, and then few mechanisms that I study, and then I will conclude. So let's start with the data. The main data source that I'm using is establishment level data from German social security records. So in particular, I am using a 1.5 random sample of all firms in Germany. This gives me employment histories of all employees that are subject to social security contributions in those firms, and allows me to count types of workers. After some sample restrictions, in particular restricting, only looking at least at firms with at least 5 workers in order to, have co-workers to observe, to have essentially in order to have variation in my main explanatory variable. I also focus on private sector in particular and on the final years of the data set, 2011 to 2018, which coincides with the major migration waves on the one hand, and on the other hand allows me to deal with some data problems related to the change in occupational classification. As the outcome, I take the long-term sick leave rate. And so let me tell you a little bit more about what this long-term sick leave rate is. In the data, I can observe the events of health insurance taking over salary payments once you've been sick for at least 6 weeks. This allows me to construct long-term sick leave rates on the firm level. I distinguish them also by gender and by origin group. So I mean native versus foreign workers. The nice feature about focusing on long-term sick leave rate in particular is that it allows me to treat the occurrence of long-term sick leave rates as capturing most likely a true health shock as opposed to a labor market decision. So namely behavioral effects, so things related to whether or not you take a few days off here or there. So this there's some literature that shows disciplining effects for shorter term sick leave. So for example, calling in sick for a few days, or like, for example, unionized workers are more likely to call in sick for a few days than non-unionized ones, and so on. And so in terms of this long-term sick leave rate in Germany, there is literature that shows that these kinds of behavioral effects are unlikely to play a role here. And so for the most part of for the vast majority of my paper, I use the long-term sick leave rate to proxy for true health shock. Nonetheless, I do explore one potential behavioral mechanism that I will discuss later on. But again, I do not find any behavioral effects at play. And so, so this long-term sick leave rate can be treated as a true health shock. In terms of the average share of foreign workers in firms, here I plot for you the average share across some broad industry categories. And I want you to kind of keep in mind 2 things about this graph. So on the one hand, common to almost all industry types, this average share of foreign workers is quite flat up until the dashed line, so up until 2011, which is the time of the first labor market opening towards the new member states of the European Union. And after 2011, these shares do grow quite drastically, but in a heterogeneous way across the different industries or industry categories. So for construction and white-collar services grow, for example, at a much higher rate than education and health. How does the long-term sick leave rate look like across the same industry categories? There's perhaps quite a lot of information, so let me again focus on 2 specific specific facts. So on one hand, across almost all industry types, the long-term sick leave rate of men is much higher than women. And the highest long-term sick leave rates are observed in physically demanding industries, in which relatively few women work in the first place. And the minority of women, so looking at the average physical job strain related to the occupations that these two groups perform, it is much lower for the minority of women that work in the construction industry than it is for the average man that works in the construction industry. And so based on this table, we kind of know two facts. On the one hand, it's important to account for industry, so for industry trends. And on the other, it's important to distinguish in the results between men and women, as they are very likely, solely looking at this figure, differentially affected by the arrival of foreign workers. So in case, yeah, I guess there are no questions, and so let me move on to my baseline model. So I start with a model that has a rich set of fixed effects. So just walking you through the subscripts, G group means, group G means native men, native women, all men or women, and so on. J is a firm and T is just the time period. And so I estimate the effects on the long-term sick leave rates of the share of foreign workers among all workers, the SJK. I take this SJK, so period K usually means T minus 1, but I also test for longer term exposures, as well as I use forward shares, so for example, T plus 1, in order to test for reverse causality later on. Importantly, the granularity and the richness of the data allows me to incorporate, firstly, the firm and year fixed effects, but also detailed region by year and industry by year fixed effects. And so the battery of these fixed effects, they allow me to capture many unobservable trends and characteristics. So for example, the local labor market conditions would be captured by the region by year fixed effects. We can think about some kind of technological change that might be health improving, that's specific to regions, or that might be industry specific. And this would also be captured. The firm fixed effects capture time invariant firm characteristics and selection to the extent that the firm quality on which the selection is taking place is constant. And so the remaining confounders have to be firm specific and time varying. And perhaps the most plausible story here would be immigrant selection into progressively less healthy firms, for example, because these firms happen to be progressively in more financial distress, and as a result, they lower their workplace standards or workplace conditions. And so in order to deal with these kinds of confounders, I adopt a firm level IV strategy, as well as I also build a auxiliary market level instrumental variable that's based on the shift share approach. And whenever I say market, I mean a region industry cell. How do I build the firm level IV? So I use the immigration following the EU labor market openings as a shock to the labor supply. So if you think back about the figure, I use post-reform firm level exposure, or I predict post-reform firm level exposure based on pre-reform characteristics. So in particular, I will be using 2008 firm characteristics in order to predict the foreign employment in those firms after on the right-hand side of this figure. This is conceptually, if you think about it, similar to the shift share approach. So the shift share approach, a firm level shift share approach, would use the historical share of historical foreign employment at the firm level. However, in my setting, firm level shift share approach is has a weak instrument problem, as most firms prior to the labor market openings had zero or very few foreign workers to begin with, and therefore absent literature on other determinants of foreign employment, I apply a random forest algorithm, so a machine learning approach, data-driven approach, in order to predict this foreign employment after 2011. So the random forest, it allows for, I give it a wide range of characteristics I will show in a second. It allows, on the one hand, for complex interactions of these characteristics while minimizing overfitting. So essentially discarding the importance of the variables that discarding the variables that are not important in the prediction. The algorithm uses the average change in the foreign employment of firms that are historically similar to a given firm for which this prediction is built. And this prediction is built separately for each year after 2011. This prediction allows me to isolate the component in the share of foreign workers that's plausibly unrelated to contemporaneous unobservable shocks. And I validate this by a pre-trends check that I will show you in a couple of slides. But before that, let me talk a little bit about about the results of the random forest. So here what I plot is the importance index of different characteristics over time. The importance index essentially shows us how important, how crucial a given variable is for the prediction, and by this importance is measured by whether if we were to take out this variable, if we were to not give this variable to the algorithm, how much would the prediction change? And what we can see here is that state, so Bundesland and broad industry category, so these, the first and the last variable, are extremely important. But also, for example, the degree of occupational regulation. Interestingly, the degree of occupational regulation becomes less important over time. So far, I have only showed you which characteristics are important, but you actually don't yet have an idea of the direction. So does the degree of occupational regulation, for example, does it have a positive or negative relationship with the predicted share of foreigners, and so on. And so this is what I will try to show you, what I'm trying to show you here. So if you focus on continuing with the story about the degree of occupational regulation, which is depicted in this part of the figure, what we can see is a roughly linear relationship for both the first and the last year of prediction. And how to read this is, so what I show you here is the average values across within the different deciles of my foreigner share prediction. So for example, in the highest decile of the prediction, so what the algorithm, so in firms that the algorithm predicts to have the highest share of foreigners in the future, the degree of occupational regulation was the lowest, meaning the proportion of the occupations that they were hiring was the lowest in this sample. And this is intuitive since occupational regulation is typically a barrier to entry for immigrant workers. If you look at the hiring rate, for example, so this is, again, you need to think about these characteristics as historical characteristics. So the hire rate in 2008 is quite linear. So it predicts quite linearly the future post-2011 share of foreign workers, namely the firms that were historically hiring more also most likely hire more in the future, and therefore they have a relatively higher share of foreign workers. For the other variables, for example, firm size, the relationship is not that linear. And this is possible given that the random forest allows for these complex interactions. Okay, so I've mentioned briefly that so how do I validate this? Yeah. The identifying assumption is that in the absence of the immigrant inflows, the sick leave rates in firms in which I assign higher versus lower instrumented exposure would have evolved similarly. And one way I can test this is by using a very similar model to the baseline model that I have already shown you, except for that I used a forward foreign share, so post 2011 foreign share, over different horizons. So this the horizon marked by tau on the pre-reform long-term sick leave rates. Then if the beta 1 gives me something kind of significant, that means that my instrument could have already predicted some differences between firms in the evolution of long-term sick leave rates. And that would mean that it's picking up potentially some other unobservable characteristics of the firms, yeah? And so I will show you the kind of table over the different horizons in a second, but the overall result is that the size and the direction of these beta 1 coefficients varies over time, and none of them are statistically different from 0. These results, so the results of the pre-trends check, but also the results, the baseline results I will be showing you later on, are not sensitive to the choice of historical year. So I choose 2008 in my baseline. I could also choose 2006. As well as using a subset of variables. So for example, using only the state and the state industry and the degree of occupational licensing is already enough to get at qualitatively the same results. So here's the table. As you can see, these coefficients over different horizons are, they don't have any particular pattern, and they're all not statistically different from 0. At the same time, the first stage coefficient is quite stable at 1.6. I also construct this auxiliary measure, so this shift share approach on this market, namely meaning region by industry level. So I do this in 2 steps because of some data limitations. I start with building the MRT, which is a predicted stock of foreign residents in a given region. And then I scale it by, so far, I think this is quite a standard shift share approach. And then in the second step, I scale it by the historical distribution of foreign workers across the different industries W. And so that overall gives me the share of foreigners that's predicted to reside in a given region R and expected to work in industry W. I use this instrument in order to so I use this MT2 instrument for the realized share of foreigners working in a given market. And I perform a similar test for pre-trends that also validates the instrumental variable here. Okay, so now for the results. I've hopefully convinced you of my estimation strategy at this point, and I can move on to the baseline results as well as tell you a little bit more about the different mechanisms I had in mind. So starting with the results for all workers, not distinguishing by origin. If you look at the leftmost estimate, which depicts the effect on the total long-term sick leave rate. what we can observe is a negative relationship. So a 10 percentage point increase in the share of foreign workers decreases the long-term sick leave rates by about 0.2. Since on average, since an average long-term sick leave rate is about 2%, that means a relative effect of about 10% with respect to the mean. Conditional on the number of fixed effects that are included, the OLS and the two-stage d-squares are not statistically different from each other. Then the middle and the right-hand side estimates are those when the long-term sick leave rate are split by gender. And what we can see from this comparison is that the total long-term the total effect is driven by men only, and there is no effect on women. We can also split the baseline results by the worker origin, so native versus foreign. And here, we see that the effect on the total sick leave rate is driven by native workers, and in particular by native men. I also perform a number of robustness checks, so controlling for additional variables, sensitivity checks related to the sample restriction that I have already kind of pointed to before, as well as some potential measurement issues related to the data. And these results are quite stable across, or are stable across a number of these different tests. Now, also focusing on the distinction between firm and market exposure, which is, I think, quite interesting, is that if you forget about the firm level exposure and you use the market level foreigner share only, it is highly predictive of these changes in long-term sick leave rates in qualitatively the same way. So a negative effect on native men, no effect on native women, and so on. However, when you include both of these measures into the model, conditional on the firm level exposure, we actually observe no additional effect from the market level exposure. So here you can see both in panel A OLS and then panel B two-stage least squares. And what you can observe is that these essentially the coefficients are still at 0.02, which is very similar to the baseline, and the inclusion of the foreign share in the market does not affect these coefficients, as well as does not change, so doesn't change the size of the firm level foreigner share, nor is it statistically significant. I also perform a number of heterogeneity analysis, and here what I find is that when it comes to the heterogeneity within firms, these effects are observed in blue-collar firms, so in construction or trade companies that are medium-sized and more strongly bound by occupational licensing. When it comes to treatment heterogeneity, I find that these effects are driven by recent arrivals in Germany. So in particular, what I mean here is the foreigners that have arrived, that had their first job in Germany ever, at most 5 years before, as well as firm new hires. When it comes to heterogeneity in timing, I find that these effects are generally more short term. So conditional on the T-1 share of foreign workers, the higher order lags actually do not predict the long-term sick leave rates. Now moving on to the mechanisms. So as I have mentioned briefly in my introduction, I find that in those firms in which we have increasingly higher share of foreign workers, we observe a decrease in the share of natives that perform manual tasks. And this is in particular found in firms in accident-intensive industries, and in those firms that hire occupations that feature high physical and moderate psychological strain. So just to give you an idea of how this looks like, in the first slide, in the first column, you have the baseline effect, and in columns 2 to 4, I first split the firms in column 2, I split the firms by their industries into 4 quartiles, where each higher quartile means a higher proportion of accidents that are typical in these industries. In columns 2, 3, and 4, I do the same thing, but with occupations. So I use an external occupational classification that gives me an idea of how, on a scale from 0 to 10, a given occupation is strenuous, physically or psychologically. And then I again divide the firms into the different quartiles. And so overall, what I'm trying to show here is that there is this decrease on average in the proportion of native men that perform manual tasks. And this is particularly true in, again, those blue-collar industries where you would expect the highest physical strain or perhaps injuries. I also study another mechanism that is perhaps as plausible as the task specialization mechanism, which is that perhaps the firms are actually displacing the unhealthy native workers and substituting them with foreign workers. Given, for example, that the foreign workers tend to be positively selected in terms of health, in particular upon arrival to the host countries. And so I studied this mechanism in 2 ways: by assessing the impact of the foreign share on the proportion of long-term sick leave rate that ends in firm exit, as well as I built the long-term sick leave rates only from episodes that lead to either firm or overall employment labor market exit. But again, I do not find any correlations. So it's not true that if you work in a firm with relatively more foreigners, you are more likely to exit the firm or the labor market altogether following a health shock. I also study 1 behavioral mechanisms in the paper. So in particular, you can imagine quite an extreme scenario where immigrant workers, despite the severity of the underlying health conditions, might not be willing to take up the long-term sick leave rates anyway. And if this can have this kind of disciplining effect on the native workers. And so how I study this is in 2 steps. I firstly estimate origin-specific norms. So in particular, I estimate this simple model with less, where I where I use a number of a wide range of characteristics on the individual level, and I build and so I estimate these origin dummies in this model and treat them as kind of origin-specific norms. And so I actually do end up with quite a large, fairly noisily estimated range of different norms through the different origins. So the reference category are Germans, so the native workers, and then a negative norm would imply lower than Germans' propensity to take sick leave, and the higher norm, or like above 0 norm, would imply a above native average propensity to take sick leave. And then I can use these estimates in order to construct firm level norms. So just sum them up or take an average. This doesn't really matter. And incorporate this average norm into my model. Again, in this case, the norms are not statistically significant, and they also do not alter the size of the coefficients on the share of foreign workers. So I take this as evidence, at least against this origin-specific norms impacting impacting the labor supply decision of native workers and impacting the take-up of the long-term sick leave rates. Okay, so let me kind of wrap up at this point. So what I find in my paper is that higher shares of foreigners in firms reduce the long-term sick leave rates that are recorded in those firms. When I decompose my effects by gender and by worker origin, I find that it's the native men that see the decline in their sick leave rates, and there's no effect on native women nor foreign workers. These health improvements are strongest in physically intensive industries. And this happens primarily through the reduction in the proportion of native men that perform manual roles. For the broader implications of the paper, because the overall long-term sick leave rate declines, the firm benefits as a whole. And this has a potential to limit this negative impact on firm productivity and the economy, of course, in this partial equilibrium setting. But this could be used as a no, this is kind of positive news for the discussion of the impact of immigration on native workers. Okay, thanks. I'm very happy if you also reach out if you have some comments about the paper that you don't want to share now, or just come up with later on. So here's my email and my website. Thanks.